Some moments change everything, and for Thomas Granger, that moment came on a stormy Texas night in 1952. A knock revealed a soaking wet girl clutching a doll, asking one question that would shatter his world. Thomas had built walls around his heart after losing his wife. His ranch was his fortress, cattle his companions. But when 8-year-old Lila appeared with desperate eyes, everything changed. She was daughter of a woman who worked his land, a woman who had vanished. What started as reluctant shelter became unlikely partnership. Together, this rancher and brave girl would search Texas backroads for answers that challenged everything Thomas knew. But what they discovered would be more dangerous than either imagined. Could their bond survive the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The knock came again, more urgent this time, cutting through the steady drumming of rain against the windows of the Granger ranch house. Thomas set down his coffee cup with a deliberate slowness that had become his way of doing most things these days. 2 years of solitude had taught him that. Rushing toward anything, even his own front door, only led to disappointment. Thunder rolled across the vast Texas, landscape like a freight train, carrying all the loneliness in the world. Thomas Granger knew that sound well. At 58, he had become intimately acquainted with solitude, had made peace with it the way a man makes peace with an old injury that aches before storms. His calloused hand moved instinctively to his chest, fingers finding the thin gold chain beneath his work shirt. Sarah's wedding ring hung there, warm against his skin, a weight he carried as penance for still being alive when she was not. The ranch stretched for 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, dotted with mesquite trees and crossed by Willow Creek when the rains were good. Tonight, the creek would be running high and fast, carrying the red Texas dirt toward the Gulf of Mexico. Thomas had built this empire with his bare hands and Sarah's unwavering faith, starting with nothing but a government loan and the stubborn belief that a man could carve out something lasting from the hardscrabble earth. Now, it felt more like a monument to everything he had lost. The knock came a third time, accompanied by a small voice that cut through the storm like a blade through his chest. "Please, mister." "I'm real cold." Thomas moved toward the heavy oak door, his boots echoing on the hardwood floors Sarah had insisted on installing. She had said a home should sound lived in, should announce the presence of life with every footstep. These days, the sound only reminded him how empty the house had become. He turned the brass deadbolt. Sarah had picked that too, said brass age better than steel, and opened the door to a sight that stopped his breath. A small black girl stood on his covered porch, soaked to the bone despite the roof's protection. Her dress was simple cotton, faded blue with tiny flowers that might have been pretty once. Water dripped from her hair in steady streams, and she held a worn cloth doll against her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. The doll's yarn hair had seen better days, its button eyes slightly loose, but it had been loved, that much was clear. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dark eyes held a mixture of fear and determination that reminded Thomas of Sarah in her final days, when the cancer was winning, but she refused to surrender without a fight. "What in the world are you doing out here, child?" She looked up at him with those impossibly large eyes. "Can you take me to find my mom?" Thomas glanced past her into the stormy night. No car in his driveway, no adult figure waiting in the shadows. Just this slip of a girl and her doll, standing in a downpour like they had materialized from the storm itself. "Where are your people? How did you get here?" "I walked." She hugged the doll tighter. "My mom used to work here. Her name's Grace Washington. She told me if anything ever happened, I should come here. She said you were a good man, Grace Washington." The name stirred something in the depths of his memory, but Thomas couldn't quite grasp it. In the past 5 years, dozens of seasonal workers had passed through his ranch during roundup and harvest times. Most of them blended together in his recollection. Hard-working folks who kept to themselves and moved on when the work was done. "When did you last see your mother?" The girl's lower lip trembled, but her voice stayed steady. 2 weeks ago. She went to look for work at the Morrison place and never came back. Mrs. Jenkins been taking care of me, but she says I can't stay no more. Says it ain't right. Jake Morrison. Now that name Thomas knew well. Morrison ran the largest spread in the county, second only to Thomas's own ranch in size, and considerably ahead in reputation for ruthlessness. If Grace Washington had gone looking for work there and disappeared, it meant trouble. The kind of trouble that had a way of swallowing people up and never spitting them back out. Thunder crashed overhead, and the girl flinched but didn't step backward. Lightning illuminated her face, revealing streaks where tears had mixed with rainwater. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the careful wall he had built around his heart. He had spent 2 years perfecting the art of not caring, of moving through his days like a ghost, haunting his own life. But this child, standing in his doorway with her worn doll and her impossible request, had managed to reach through all his defenses with a single question. "Come inside before you catch your death," he heard himself saying. "We'll figure this out in the morning." The girl stepped across the threshold, and Thomas closed the door against the storm. She stood in his foyer, dripping water onto Sarah's Persian rug, looking around with wide eyes at the life Thomas had built and then abandoned to memory. Pictures lined the hallway. Thomas and Sarah at their wedding, their various anniversary celebrations, Sarah tending her garden, the two of them at church socials and county fairs. A lifetime of happiness frozen in silver frames, gathering dust like everything else in the house. "You got a real nice house, mister." It's Thomas. Thomas Granger. He realized he had not spoken his own name aloud to another person in weeks. And this house used to be nice. Now it's just big. The girl studied him with the peculiar intensity children possessed, seeing things adults had learned to ignore. "You're sad," she said. It was not a question. Thomas touched the chain at his throat, Sarah's ring pressing against his palm through the fabric of his shirt. "We all got our burdens to bear, child. What's your name?" Lila Washington." She held up the doll. "This is Martha. My mama made her for me when I was little." "Well, Lila Washington, you're about to catch pneumonia standing there in those wet clothes. Let me find you something dry to wear and get some food in you," as Thomas led the girl deeper into his house, past the living room where he spent his evenings reading and drinking himself to sleep, past the kitchen where he ate his solitary meals. He felt the weight of an unwelcome realization settling over him. For the first time in 2 years, he was not alone in this house. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, he had someone depending on him for something more than just a day's wages. The girl followed him up the stairs to the guest room Sarah had always kept ready for visitors who seldom came. Thomas pulled out an old shirt of his and a pair of Sarah's sewing pants she had left behind. They would swallow the child whole, but they were dry and warm. "You change into these," he said, setting the clothes on the bed. "I'll heat up some soup." As he descended the stairs, Thomas caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror. His grey hair had grown shaggy, his beard untrimmed. He looked like a man who had given up on the world, and maybe he had. But now he had this child in his house, this Lila Washington with her worn doll and her impossible faith that he could help her find her mother. He touched the wedding ring through his shirt one more time, hearing Sarah's voice as clearly as if she was standing beside him. "Thomas Granger, you have always been too stubborn to know when the good Lord is offering you a second chance." Maybe she was right. Maybe this storm had brought him more than just a lost child. Maybe it had brought him a chance to remember who he used to be, before grief had hollowed him out and left him going through the motions of living without really being alive. In the kitchen, as he heated a can of vegetable soup and listened to the small sounds of the child moving around upstairs, Thomas began to understand that his life had just taken a turn towards something he had thought was lost to him forever: purpose. The morning sun broke through the storm clouds like forgiveness, casting long shadows across the ranch yard and highlighting every puddle left by the night's rain. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, watching the light dance on the wet grass while he waited for his coffee to finish brewing. Behind him, small footsteps creaked across the floor as Lila made her way downstairs, still drowning in his old work shirt and Sarah's pants. "Morning." "Mr. Thomas." He turned to find her clutching Martha, the worn doll, against her chest. In the harsh light of day, she looked even smaller than she had the night before. A wisp of a child who should have been getting ready for school instead of searching for her missing mother. "Just Thomas is fine. He poured her a glass of milk and set it on the kitchen table alongside a plate of biscuits, left over from yesterday. "Eat up. I'm going to take you into town this morning." Lila climbed onto one of Sarah's ladderback chairs, her feet dangling a good foot from the floor. "To look for my mama?" Thomas settled into his own chair, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup to hide their slight tremor. He had been awake most of the night, turning the situation over in his mind like a man examining a piece of broken machinery, looking for the part that might fix everything. The conclusion he had reached was not one he particularly liked, but it was the only sensible option. "To take you to Sheriff Bailey. He'll know what to do about finding your mother." The girl stopped chewing, her dark eyes fixed on his face. "You don't want to help me find her yourself?" The question hit him harder than it should have. Thomas set down his coffee and looked out the window again, watching his cattle move slowly across the pasture toward the creek. Simple creatures with simple needs: food, water, shelter. They did not ask complicated questions or make impossible requests. "It's not about what I want, Lila. It's about what's right. You need to be with your own people while the law sorts this out." "My own people?" Her voice was small, but there was steel beneath it. "My mama's the only people I got, and she told me to come to you." Thomas felt the familiar weight of Sarah's ring against his chest, a reminder of all the ways good intentions could lead to heartbreak. He had learned the hard way that caring too much about someone only gave the world more ways to hurt you. Better to keep his distance, let the proper authorities handle things. "Sheriff Bailey's a good man. He'll take care of you." Lila set down her biscuit and reached into the pocket of Martha's tiny dress. She pulled out a creased photograph, handling it like it was made of spun glass. "This is my mama," she said, sliding the picture across the table toward him. "Grace Washington. You said you might remember her." Thomas picked up the photograph, and the breath caught in his throat. The woman in the picture was young, maybe 25, with gentle eyes and a smile that seemed to hold all the warmth missing from his own life. She was standing in front of a small house, wearing a simple dress and holding a baby who could only be Lila. But it was not just the woman's face that stopped him. It was the background of the photograph. He recognized that house. It sat on the eastern edge of his property, a small cabin he had built years ago for seasonal workers. The last time he remembered it being occupied was, when was this picture taken? 3 years ago when I was 5. Mama said it was right before we had to move away from the pretty little house. Thomas stared at the photograph, pieces of memory shifting and settling like sediment in still water. 3 years ago. Sarah had still been alive then, still tending her garden and fussing over the workers during harvest time. She had always insisted on providing decent housing for the families who helped bring in the crops, had argued with Thomas when he suggested they could save money by offering less. She was a good worker, Sarah had told him one evening over dinner. And that little girl of hers is sweet as pie. Grace brings her by the garden sometimes, and she helps me weed the tomatoes. The memory came back in a rush. Grace Washington, quiet and dignified, always prompt, always thorough. And Lila, just 5 years old then, following Sarah around the vegetable garden like a devoted puppy. How had he forgotten? How had he let such simple kindness slip from his mind? "I remember her now," he said quietly, still looking at the photograph. "She worked the harvest that year. Good worker. Kept to herself mostly. Why did you make us leave?" The question was like a physical blow. Thomas looked up to find Lila watching him with those impossibly direct eyes, waiting for an answer he was not sure he could give. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in Sarah's illness and his own growing isolation, as he watched his wife fade away. The work was finished. Seasonal workers move on when the season ends, but Mama wanted to stay. She told me this was the happiest she'd ever been, working for you and Miss Sarah. She cried when we had to go. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. He remembered now. Sarah had asked him about offering Grace permanent work, maybe helping with the house and garden. But he had been consumed with doctor appointments and treatments, with the growing certainty that he was losing the only person who had ever truly mattered to him. He had not wanted strangers in the house, watching their private grief unfold. Things were complicated then, he said. It sounded hollow even to his own ears. Lila carefully took back the photograph, tucking it into Martha's pocket like she was putting away something precious. Mama said you were grieving. Said that's why you couldn't see straight anymore. But she also said underneath all that sadness, you were still a good man. The words hit him like a fist to the solar plexus. Grace Washington had seen through his grief to something he was no longer sure existed. She had understood what he had been. Too lost to understand himself. That pain could make a person blind to everything good still left in the world. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She is wise. Lila's correction was firm. And I ain't going to know sheriff until I find her. Thomas looked at the child sitting at his kitchen table, wearing his clothes and holding on to hope with both hands. She had walked miles through a storm to reach him, had trusted in her mother's faith that he would help. Now she was asking him to honor that faith, to be the man Grace Washington had believed he could still be. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds. His cattle were settling into their morning routine, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of his neighbor's tractor starting up. The world was moving forward as it always did, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in kitchen conversations and the weight of impossible choices. If I take you to Sheriff Bailey, will you at least tell him what you told me about your mother working for Morrison? Lila shook her head. I told you, Mr. Thomas, I ain't going nowhere until we find my mama. She said you'd help me. She said you were the kind of man who keeps his word. Thomas closed his eyes and felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble around him. Grace Washington had seen something in him that he had lost sight of completely. Maybe it was time to find out if she had been right. All right, Lila Washington, he said, opening his eyes to meet hers. All right. Thomas's office occupied the back corner of the ranch house, a cluttered sanctuary where he kept the business of running 3,000 acres, contained within 4 walls, lined with filing cabinets and ledgers. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that Sarah used to clean every week. Now they bore the film of 2 years' worth of neglect, a testament to how thoroughly he had let the details of living slide away from him. Lila perched on the edge of an old leather chair. Martha balanced carefully on her lap, watching as Thomas pulled file after file from the metal cabinet marked personnel records. Each folder represented someone who had worked his land: cowboys, seasonal hands, harvest crews, fence repair specialists, lives that had intersected with his for weeks or months before moving on to other ranches, other opportunities. Here, he said, settling a thick manila folder on the desk between them. The tab read Washington Grace M. in Sarah's neat handwriting. His wife had always handled the paperwork for seasonal workers, had insisted on maintaining detailed records of wages paid, work performed, and personal information for tax purposes. Thomas opened the folder and immediately understood why Sarah had kept such meticulous records. The first document was Grace's employment application, filled out in careful cursive that spoke of education and pride. She had listed her previous work experience: housekeeping for a family in Dallas, picking cotton for various operations across East Texas, cleaning offices in Houston during the winter months. Always moving, always searching for something better. Under reason for leaving last position, she had written simply, seeking stable work environment for my daughter. She wanted to stay in one place, Lila said, reading over his shoulder. She got tired of us always moving around. The next document was a formal work contract. outlining Grace's duties during harvest season, fieldwork during the day, assistance with meal preparation for the crew in the evenings, general maintenance of the workers' quarters. The wages were fair by 1949 standards, though Thomas found himself wondering if they had been enough to support a single mother and her child. But it was the third document that stopped him cold. Sarah had created a detailed work ledger, recording not just Grace's hours and wages, but observations about her performance and character. The entries were written in his wife's familiar hand, small notes that painted a picture of a woman Thomas was ashamed to realize he had barely noticed at the time. Sept 15. Grace Washington is exceptionally reliable, always first to arrive, last to leave. Other workers respect her leadership. Set 22. Grace helped young Miguel Martinez when he injured his hand, cleaned and bandaged the wound herself, shows natural compassion and medical knowledge. OCT 1. Grace's daughter Lila is a delightful child, very bright and well-mannered. Grace is raising her beautifully despite their circumstances. Oct 8. Asked Grace about permanent position. She was very interested but worried about housing arrangements. Suggested she might take over some of my household duties as arthritis makes daily tasks more difficult. Thomas stopped reading. He remembered Sarah's arthritis, how it had begun to limit her ability to manage the house in those months before her cancer diagnosis. He also remembered dismissing her suggestion about hiring Grace permanently, insisting they could manage on their own. "What does it say?" Lila asked, trying to read the handwriting upside down. "Your mother made quite an impression on my wife." Thomas continued reading, his throat tightening with each entry. Oct 15. Grace organized the other workers to surprise me with a small birthday celebration. She made a cake from scratch, using ingredients from the general store. Such thoughtfulness from someone who has so little herself. Oct 20. Grace asked about staying through winter months, offered to help with house cleaning, cooking, and my garden preparation for spring. Thomas said no. I think this was a mistake. The final entry was dated October 30th, 1949. Grace and Lila left today after harvest ended. Grace thanked us both for the opportunity and said this had been the happiest time of her life. Little Lila cried when saying goodbye. She had become quite attached to our garden and to helping me with the preserves. I will miss them both terribly. Grace is the sort of person who makes the world brighter simply by being in it. Thomas closed the ledger and sat back in his chair, feeling like a man who had just discovered he had thrown away something precious without realizing its value. Grace Washington had not been just another seasonal worker. She had been a woman looking for a home, a place where she and her daughter could build something lasting. And he had sent her away because he could not see past his own approaching grief. "Miss Sarah liked us," Lila said softly. "She loved you both." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Your mother was special, Lila. I was just too wrapped up in my own troubles to see it clearly." The sound of the front door opening interrupted his growing self-recrimination. Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floors, accompanied by a woman's voice calling out in Spanish and English. "Senor Thomas, I saw your truck in the drive. Are you feeling poorly today?" Thomas looked at Lila. "That's Rosa Martinez. She comes by twice a week to help with the house and cooking. She might remember your mother." They made their way to the kitchen, where Thomas found Rosa Martinez unpacking groceries from a cloth bag. Rosa had worked for him for nearly 15 years, starting when Sarah first became too tired to manage all the household duties alone. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes fixed immediately on Lila, taking in the oversized clothes and the worn doll clutched against her chest. "¿Qué es esto?" Rosa's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Thomas, who is this child?" "This is Lila Washington. Her mother is Grace Washington. She worked here during harvest 3 years ago." Recognition dawned in Rosa's weathered features. "I see. Grace, the pretty woman with the little girl who loved the garden." She looked more closely at Lila. "You have grown so much, Nina. But where is your mama?" That's what we're trying to find out, Thomas said. Grace went looking for work at the Morrison place 2 weeks ago and hasn't been seen since. Rosa's face darkened. She crossed herself quickly and muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Morrison is not a good man, Thomas. You know this. What do you know about him? I know what every woman in the county knows. He has wandering hands and a quick temper. And I know that women who work for him sometimes. She glanced at Lila and switched to Spanish. A veces desaparecen. Sometimes they disappear. Thomas felt ice settle in his stomach. Rosa, this is important. What have you heard? She moved closer, lowering her voice. There are stories, Thomas. Whispers at the church socials. Women who went to work for Morrison and were never seen again. But no one talks about it openly. Morrison has too much influence. Too many friends in the sheriff's office. Thomas looked down at Lila, who was watching their conversation with the intense focus of a child who understood that adult whispers often contained the most important truths. We're going to find her, he said, the commitment settling over him like a mantle he had forgotten how to wear. Whatever it takes. The compass had belonged to Thomas's father, a man who believed that every journey, no matter how uncertain the destination, deserved a true sense of direction. Now it sat heavy in Thomas's palm as he stood beside his pickup truck, its brass surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The needle pointed steadily north, unwavering despite the tremor in his hands. What's that, Mr. Thomas? Lila asked, sliding across the bench seat to get a better look. Something to help us find our way. He tucked the compass into his shirt pocket, right next to Sarah's ring. Some talismans were for remembering the past. Others were for navigating toward an uncertain future. My daddy gave it to me when I was about your age. Said a man should always know which direction he's heading, even when he's not sure where he's going. Lila considered this with the seriousness children brought to adult wisdom. Are we lost? Thomas started the engine, the old Ford rumbling to life like a faithful horse ready for work. Not lost exactly, but we're definitely heading into unfamiliar territory. Their first stop was the Brennan Ranch, 5 miles east along the county road that connected the scattered properties of Willowbrook County. Pat Brennan had been Thomas's neighbor for 20 years, a decent man who ran a smaller operation focused on breeding horses rather than cattle. If Grace had been looking for work in the area, Brennan would likely have heard about it. The Brennan house sat in a grove of old oak trees, its white paint fresh and bright in the morning sun. Pat himself emerged from the barn as Thomas parked the truck, wiping his hands on a greasy rag and squinting at his unexpected visitors. Thomas Granger, Pat called out, walking toward them with the easy gait of a man comfortable on his own land. Don't think I've seen you off your place in months. What brings you... He stopped short when Lila climbed out of the passenger side. Well, I'll be damned. Pat, this is Lila Washington. Her mother Grace worked for me during harvest a few years back. She's been missing for 2 weeks now. Pat's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral in the way of men who sensed complicated situations approaching. Missing how? Went looking for work and never came home. Lila here walked all the way to my place during that storm 2 nights ago, asking for help finding her. Pat looked down at Lila, taking in her small stature and determined expression. That's a long walk for a little thing like you. Must be important. My mama's the most important thing in the world, Lila said simply. Something in Pat's demeanor softened. I'm sure she is, honey. But I haven't seen your mother around here. Haven't had any black folks looking for work in quite some time. Thomas felt the compass pressing against his chest. We heard she might have gone to the Morrison place. You know anything about that? Pat's face closed off entirely. Morrison's business is Morrison's business. I don't involve myself in his affairs, and I'd advise you to do the same. This is about a missing woman, Pat, a mother, and I'm sorry for that. I truly am. Pat's voice carried the tone of a man ending a conversation. But I can't help you, Thomas. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Grace Washington. As they drove away from the Brennan place, Lila stared out the window at the passing landscape. He was lying, she said quietly. Thomas glanced at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. What makes you say that? His eyes. They went all shifty when you mentioned Morrison. And he called my mama any Grace Washington, like she wasn't a real person with a name. The girl was right, Thomas realized. Pat Brennan had been uncomfortable from the moment Grace's name was mentioned, and his discomfort had nothing to do with not knowing her. It had everything to do with knowing more than he was willing to say. Their next stop was the Rodriguez spread, a small family operation run by Miguel Rodriguez and his 2 adult sons. Miguel had always struck Thomas as an honest man, someone who treated his workers fairly regardless of their background. If anyone would give them straight answers, it would be Miguel. They found the older man repairing fence near the road, his weathered hands working wire cutters with practiced efficiency. When Thomas called out a greeting, Miguel looked up with a genuine smile that faded quickly when he saw Lila. "Thomas, good to see you, amigo. And who is this young lady?" "This is Lila Washington. Her mother Grace is missing. We're trying to trace her movements, see if anyone's seen her recently." Miguel set down his tools and removed his hat, running a hand through his gray hair. "Grace Washington. See, I remember her. Worked for you a few years back during harvest. Good worker, very reliable. Have you seen her recently? In the past month or so?" Miguel's expression grew troubled. "See, actually I have. Maybe 3 weeks ago she came by asking about work. I told her I had nothing available until spring roundup, but I gave her some names of other ranchers who might need help." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What names?" "Well, I mentioned the Henderson place, though old Doc Henderson doesn't really run cattle anymore. And I suggested she might try—" Miguel paused, glancing at Lila with obvious reluctance. "Go on, Miguel. This is important. I suggested she might try Morrison. I know he's always looking for help, and he pays better than most." Miguel's voice carried a note of regret. "Maybe I shouldn't have sent her there." "Why not?" Miguel picked up his wire cutters again, focusing intently on the fence repair. "You hear things, stories. Morrison, he has a reputation for being difficult to work for, especially with women." The compass seemed to grow heavier against Thomas's chest. "What kind of stories, Miguel?" "The kind of stories decent men don't repeat in front of children." Miguel's eyes met Thomas's over Lila's head. "But if I were you, amigo, I would be very careful about going to Morrison's place, asking questions. He does not like people poking around in his business." As they drove toward their next destination, Thomas pulled the compass from his pocket and checked their direction. The needle pointed steadily north, toward the Morrison ranch that sprawled across the county line, like a dark kingdom unto itself. "Mr. Thomas?" Lila's voice was small in the cab of the truck. "Are you scared?" Thomas looked at the child beside him, this brave girl who had walked through a storm to find help, who trusted him to honor her mother's faith in his character. He thought about the compass in his hand, about his father's belief that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite the fear. "Yes," he said honestly, "I am scared. But we're going to keep looking anyway, because that's what you do when someone you care about is in trouble." Lila nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "My mom always says courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway." Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. "Your mama sounds like a very wise woman." "She is. And we're going to find her." The compass needle held steady, pointing toward whatever truth awaited them at the Morrison place. The abandoned cabin sat like a broken tooth in the landscape. Its roof partially caved in, and walls weathered to the color of old bones. Thomas parked the truck beside what had once been a garden, now overrun with weeds and volunteer mesquite saplings. The place had been empty for at least 5 years, ever since the Hartwell family lost their lease and moved on to Oklahoma. "Why are we stopping here?" Lila asked, peering through the windshield at the derelict structure. "Because sometimes, when people are in trouble, they look for places where they won't be found." Thomas climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the broken glass that littered the yard. "If your mother was scared or hurt, she might have thought to hide somewhere like this." They approached the cabin carefully, Thomas leading the way and testing each floorboard before putting his full weight on it. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and the windows stared like empty sockets. Inside, the single room was thick with dust and shadows. furnished only with debris and the memories of whoever had called this place home. But someone had been here recently. Thomas knelt beside a makeshift bed composed of old blankets and newspapers. The arrangement was too neat, too purposeful to be the work of drifters or animals. Someone had slept here, and not very long ago. "Mr. Thomas, look at this." Lila was standing by the window, pointing at something on the narrow sill. Thomas joined her and found himself staring at a small pile of items that made his heart clench with recognition. A hairbrush with a few dark strands still caught in its bristles, a bar of soap worn down to a sliver, and a tiny cloth pouch that might have held personal belongings. "These could belong to anybody," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were false comfort. Lila picked up the hairbrush with reverent care, examining the strands of hair in the late afternoon light. "This is my mama's brush. She always carried it in her bag." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She was here, Mr. Thomas. My mama was here." Thomas continued searching the cabin, looking for anything that might tell them what had happened or where Grace had gone from here. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of rotted lumber, he found something that stopped his breath cold. It was a locket, small and silver, broken open at the hinge. Inside, a tiny piece of fabric had been carefully placed, blue cotton with small white flowers that matched exactly the pattern of Lila's dress. The same pattern Grace had been wearing in the photograph. "Lila," he called softly. "Come here, honey." She crossed to him, still clutching the hairbrush against her chest like a lifeline. When she saw the locket in his palm, her eyes filled with tears. "Mama gave me that for my 7th birthday. She said it was so I could always carry a piece of her with me, even when we were apart." Lila touched the broken chain with one finger. She must have dropped it, or it had been torn from her neck, Thomas thought, but he kept that possibility to himself. Instead, he carefully placed the locket in his pocket alongside the compass and Sarah's ring. Evidence was evidence, and this cabin was telling them a story he was beginning to understand. Grace Washington had been here, had hidden here for some period of time, but she had not left voluntarily. The personal items, the broken locket, the sense of interrupted occupancy all pointed to a sudden, unwilling departure. The sound of a truck engine approaching made them both freeze. Through the broken window, Thomas could see dust rising from the dirt road that led to the cabin. "Someone was coming, and fast. Stay behind me," Thomas told Lila, moving toward the door. The truck that pulled up was newer and larger than Thomas's modest Ford, a gleaming black Chevrolet with chrome bumpers and running boards that spoke of serious money. The man who climbed out was equally impressive in his expensive clothes and polished boots. But there was something in his pale eyes that made Thomas's skin crawl. Jake Morrison stood just over 6 feet tall, with the kind of bland handsomeness that hid a multitude of sins. His smile was all teeth and no warmth as he approached the cabin, his gaze taking in Thomas's truck and then fixing on Thomas himself with predatory interest. "Well, well, Thomas Granger, as I live and breathe, what brings you to this God-forsaken place?" "Just looking around, Jake. Heard someone might have been squatting here." Morrison's smile widened, becoming even less pleasant. "Squatting, huh? That's a serious accusation, Thomas. Property rights are sacred in Texas, as I'm sure you know. It's not an accusation. Just checking on abandoned property, same as any good neighbor would do." "Good neighbor," Morrison chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's interesting coming from you. I hear you've been asking questions around the county. Questions about a certain colored woman who went missing." Thomas felt every muscle in his body tense. "News travels fast." "It does indeed. And I have to wonder why a man like you would interest himself in the comings and goings of field hands. Unless, of course, your interest is more personal than professional." The insinuation hit Thomas like a physical blow, carrying with it all the ugly implications Morrison intended. In 1950s Texas, such suggestions could destroy a man's reputation and endanger everyone involved. "My interest is in helping a child find her mother," Thomas said carefully. "Nothing more, nothing less." "A child?" Morrison's eyes narrowed, scanning the area around the cabin. "What child would that be?" Thomas realized with sickening clarity that he had made a potentially fatal mistake. Lila was still inside the cabin, hopefully hidden behind the debris, but Morrison was the kind of man who would search until he found what he was looking for, a child in town. "Ask me to keep an eye out for her missing mother." Morrison studied Thomas's face with the intensity of a card player looking for tells. "You know, Thomas, I've always respected you. Good rancher, decent man, kept to himself after that unfortunate business with your wife. But a man can make poor choices when he's not thinking clearly, especially when those choices involve getting mixed up with people who aren't his own kind." The words were spoken with conversational ease, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. Morrison was warning him off, using the social taboos of their time and place as weapons. "I appreciate your concern, Jake, but I can take care of my own affairs." "I'm sure you can. But sometimes a man needs reminding about which affairs are truly his to take care of." Morrison tipped his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "Good day, Thomas. Give my regards to whoever might be interested in your current activities." As Morrison's truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, Thomas felt the full weight of what they were up against settling on his shoulders. This was not just about finding one missing woman. This was about challenging the established order of things, about crossing lines that men like Morrison would kill to keep intact. Inside the cabin, Lila emerged from her hiding place, her eyes wide with understanding beyond her years. "That was a bad man," she said simply. Thomas nodded, fingering the broken locket in his pocket. "Yes, honey. That was a very bad man, and they were going to have to face him again before this was over." The Willowbrook County Sheriff's Office occupied a squat brick building on Main Street, wedged between Murphy's Hardware and the First Baptist Church like an afterthought in civic planning. Thomas had always found it telling that law enforcement sat in the shadow of both commerce and religion, beholden to both, but serving neither with complete honesty. Sheriff Ray Bailey was a large man gone soft around the middle, with thinning hair and the kind of mustache that suggested authority without conveying competence. He looked up from his paperwork with the expression of someone interrupted during important business, though Thomas could see he'd been working on a crossword puzzle. "Thomas Granger. Don't see you in town much these days." Bailey's eyes shifted to Lila, who stood close beside Thomas, clutching Martha against her chest. "And who might this young lady be?" "This is Lila Washington. Her mother Grace has been missing for 2 weeks, and I'd like to file a report." Bailey set down his pencil with deliberate slowness. "Missing person report, I see. And what's your relationship to this, Grace Washington?" The pause before Grace's name was subtle but pointed, carrying the weight of assumptions Thomas was beginning to recognize in every conversation about this matter. "Grace worked for me during harvest season a few years back. This is her daughter, and she came to me for help when her mother disappeared." Disappeared. Bailey opened a desk drawer and pulled out a blank form, though his movements suggested reluctance rather than efficiency. "Tell me about the circumstances." Thomas recounted what they knew: Grace's search for work, her planned visit to the Morrison ranch, her failure to return home. As he spoke, he watched Bailey's expression carefully, looking for signs of genuine concern or professional interest. What he found instead was the carefully neutral face of a man going through motions he had no intention of completing. "And you say she was supposed to go to Morrison's place?" "That's what we've been told by multiple sources." Bailey made a show of writing notes, but Thomas could see most of what he put down was meaningless scribbles. "Well, Thomas, I appreciate you coming in, but I have to tell you, these kinds of cases are tricky. Seasonal workers, they come and go. Sometimes they move on without telling folks. Family obligations, better opportunities elsewhere. She wouldn't leave without me." Lila spoke up for the first time, her small voice carrying absolute conviction. "My mama would never leave without me." Bailey looked at the child with the kind of patronizing smile adults reserved for naive statements. "Now, honey, adults sometimes have to make difficult decisions. Your mama might have had reasons you don't understand." Thomas felt heat rise in his chest. "Sheriff, this woman has a child. She wouldn't abandon her daughter. Something has happened to Grace Washington, and it's your job to find out what. My job, Bailey said, his voice taking on a harder edge, is to maintain law and order in this county. And part of that job involves understanding which cases are worth pursuing and which ones are likely to cause more trouble than they solve. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired gun. Bailey had just told them in so many words that he had no intention of investigating Grace's disappearance, because doing so might disturb the established order of things. Are you saying you won't look for her? Bailey leaned back in his chair, his bulk creaking against the springs. I'm saying I'll file the report as required by law, but I'm also saying that in my experience, these situations usually resolve themselves without law enforcement intervention. Thomas looked around the office, taking in the wanted posters on the walls, the filing cabinets that presumably held years' worth of cases and reports. On Bailey's desk, alongside the crossword puzzle, sat a stack of folders tied with string, old cases archived and forgotten. How many other women have gone missing in this county, Sheriff? Bailey's face went very still. I'm not sure what you're implying, Thomas. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question. How many black women have disappeared from this area in the past few years? Now you listen here, because I'm starting to think there might be a pattern. And I'm starting to think you might know more about it than you're letting on. Bailey stood up slowly, his bulk creating an intimidating presence behind the desk. Thomas, I'm going to give you some free advice, on account of I've known you for 20 years, and I respect what you went through with your wife. You need to be very careful about the accusations you make and the company you keep. This county has a way of dealing with troublemakers, and right now you're walking a very thin line. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual tone of a man who had made similar warnings before. Thomas realized with growing clarity that Sheriff Bailey was not just incompetent, he was actively complicit in whatever was happening to women like Grace. I want to see any reports you have about missing black women in this county. Those records are confidential. They're public information and you know it. Thomas moved closer to the desk. Unless, of course, you never bothered to create proper reports in the first place. Bailey's face flushed red above his mustache. For a moment, Thomas thought the man might refuse entirely. Then something shifted in his expression. Perhaps the realization that Thomas was not going to be dismissed or intimidated as easily as others had been. Wait here. Bailey disappeared into a back room, leaving Thomas and Lila alone in the office. Thomas could hear files being moved, drawers opening and closing. When Bailey returned, he carried a thin folder that he placed on the desk with obvious reluctance. These are the reports I have on file for missing persons matching your criteria. Thomas opened the folder and felt his stomach drop. There were 5 reports dating back 3 years. 5 black women, aged between 20 and 35, all listed as missing, with minimal investigation details. Most of the reports were incomplete, lacking basic information like last known addresses or employment records. All 5 cases had been marked inactive, subject presumed relocated, but it was the 6th document that made Thomas's hands shake with anger. Tucked behind the official reports was a handwritten note on Sheriff's Office letterhead. Spoke with Morrison Ree, Grace Washington matter. No employment offered. Suggested woman may have moved on to seek work elsewhere. No further investigation warranted unless family members request official intervention through proper channels. The note was dated 2 days after Grace's disappearance. Bailey had known about her missing status from the beginning and had chosen to bury it after a single conversation with Jake Morrison. "You son of a bitch," Thomas whispered. Bailey snatched the folder back. "Now see here, Thomas, you knew she was missing. You knew, and you covered it up." Thomas felt 20 years of civic respect crumbling into contempt. "How many other women, Ray? How many other mothers and daughters have you written off because it was easier than doing your job? You don't understand the complexities of law enforcement in this county. I understand that you're either a coward or a collaborator. Maybe both." Bailey's face went from red to purple. "Get out of my office, Thomas, and take that child with you. If I see you back here making wild accusations, I'll have you arrested for disturbing the peace." As they walked back to the truck, Lila slipped her small hand into Thomas's. "Are we in trouble, Mr. Thomas?" Thomas looked down at the brave girl beside him, thinking about the other women whose names were in that folder, the other daughters who might be wondering why their mothers never came home. "No, honey, we're not in trouble, but some other people are about to be." He had entered Bailey's office as a concerned citizen seeking help from the authorities. He was leaving as something entirely different, a man who understood that sometimes justice had to be pursued outside the boundaries of law and order, by people willing to risk everything for what was right. The compass in his pocket seemed to pulse with purpose, pointing not just north, but toward a reckoning that was long overdue. Rosa Martinez had always possessed the kind of intuition that came from a lifetime of watching powerful men make dangerous decisions. When Thomas and Lila returned from town, she took one look at their faces and set down her cleaning rag. "Que pasó?" she asked, though she could read the answer in Thomas's grim expression and the way Lila pressed closer to his side. The sheriff's office was worse than useless. "Bailey's been covering up missing women cases for years." Thomas sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 58 years. "I think we're on our own, Rosa." Rosa nodded, as if this confirmed something she had long suspected. "Then it is good that I remembered something while you were gone. Something Grace told me the day before she left your ranch 3 years ago." Thomas looked up sharply. "What kind of something?" She was worried, that woman. Scared about leaving, but also scared about staying. "She asked me about places where a person could hide things, important things, that needed to be kept safe." Lila moved closer to Rosa, drawn by the possibility of new information about her mother. "What kind of things?" Rosa's weathered hands smoothed Lila's hair with maternal gentleness. "She didn't say, Nina, but I told her about the old root cellar behind the workers' quarters. The one that nobody uses anymore, where your mama and I stored preserves during the war." Thomas felt the compass stirring against his chest, as if his father's old talisman was responding to the pull of true direction. "Show us." The root cellar had been dug into a hillside behind the seasonal workers' cabins during the Depression, when every family needed places to store food against uncertain times. Sarah had used it for canning overflow until the modern pantry addition made it unnecessary. Now it was just a wooden door set into the earth, hidden by volunteer peach trees and decades of neglect. The door stuck when Thomas tried to open it, swollen by years of rain and neglect. But inside, the space was dry and cool, lined with stone walls and wooden shelves that still held a few forgotten jars of preserves from Sarah's final harvest season. Rosa directed them to the back corner, where a loose stone in the wall could be removed to reveal a small hiding space. Thomas worked the stone free and reached into the darkness beyond, his fingers encountering something wrapped in oiled cloth. What he pulled out made his breath catch in his throat. It was a bundle of letters, tied with kitchen string and addressed in Grace's careful handwriting to "My precious Lila." The paper was good quality, the kind a woman would have to save money to purchase. Thomas could see that some of the letters were thicker than others, as if Grace had written them over multiple days or included additional documents. "She wrote to me." Lila's voice was barely above a whisper. "Appears so." Thomas handed her the bundle with reverence. "These are yours, honey. Your mother meant for you to have them." With trembling fingers, Lila untied the string and opened the first letter. The ink had held well in the dry cellar, and Grace's words emerged clear and strong across the years. "My dearest Lila, if you are reading this, it means something has happened to me, and Mr. Thomas has been kind enough to help you look. I pray to God that day never comes, but a mother has to prepare for all possibilities." Thomas and Rosa listened in silence as Lila read aloud, her young voice carrying her mother's words back into the world. The early letters were filled with expressions of love, memories of their time together, and hopes for their future. But as Lila continued reading, the tone began to change. October 15th, 1949. I heard something today that troubles my heart. Two of the other workers were talking about a woman named Betsy who worked for Mr. Morrison last season. They said she disappeared suddenly and no one has seen her since. I wanted to ask Mr. Morrison about it when I applied for winter work, but the way the men's voices got quiet when they spoke her name made me think it might not be safe to ask such questions. Lila looked up from the letter, her eyes wide with understanding. Mama knew something was wrong even then. Keep reading. Honey, the next letter was dated a week later, and Grace's concern had deepened. October 22nd, 1949. I spoke with Rosa today about my worries. She confirmed what I suspected, that women sometimes go to work for certain ranches and are never seen again. She begged me not to pursue winter work at the Morrison place, but I am desperate, Lila. Mrs. Sarah's illness means there will be no permanent position here, and we need income to survive until spring. Thomas felt guilt settle in his stomach like a stone. Even then, Grace had wanted to stay, had seen the danger in leaving, but felt she had no choice because he had been too consumed with his own grief to offer her security. The letters continued chronologically, documenting Grace's growing desperation and her decision to apply for work despite her fears. But it was the final letter, written just days before she disappeared, that made Thomas's blood run cold. March 18th, 1952. My worst fears have been realized. I took the job at Morrison's ranch, and what I have discovered here is beyond terrible. Lila, my precious girl, if something happens to me, you must know that Jake Morrison is not just a bad employer. He's a murderer. I've found evidence of what happened to Betsy and the others. There is a place on his land where he takes women who displease him or who learn too much about his business. I'm writing this in secret, hiding it where I pray you will never need to find it. The letter continued with details that made Thomas's hands shake with rage. Grace had discovered that Morrison was using his ranch as a front for illegal activities, smuggling operations that moved contraband across the Mexican border under cover of legitimate cattle drives. Women who worked for him and learned too much about his operation simply disappeared, buried in unmarked graves on the vast expanse of his property. But Grace had done more than just observe. She had gathered evidence. March 20th, 1952, I have managed to photograph the documents in Morrison's office that show his connections to smuggling operations. The pictures are hidden in this same place, wrapped separately. I also have a map showing where the bodies are buried. If anything happens to me, this evidence must reach honest law enforcement, not Sheriff Bailey, who I believe takes money from Morrison to look the other way. Lila set down the letter and looked at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. She was trying to stop him. My mama was trying to save other women from what happened to her. Thomas reached into the hiding space again and found two more oilcloth packages. One contained photographs of documents, ledgers showing payments, transportation schedules, and correspondence with criminal contacts in Mexico and Louisiana. The other contained a detailed map of Morrison's property, with several locations marked with small crosses. Grace Washington had not just stumbled into danger. She had deliberately gathered evidence against a man she knew was capable of killing her, because she understood that her death would mean nothing if it did not protect future victims. Rosa crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish. Dios mío. That brave woman, she knew she was walking into death, but she did it anyway. Thomas studied the map, his mind already working through the implications. This was not just evidence of past crimes. It was a roadmap to finding Grace's body and proving Morrison's guilt beyond any doubt. But it was also a death warrant for anyone who tried to use it. Mr. Thomas, Lila said, her voice steady despite her tears. We have to stop him. We have to make sure he can't hurt anyone else like he hurt my mama. Thomas looked at this 8-year-old girl who had inherited her mother's courage along with her mother's tragedy. Grace Washington had died, trying to save people she would never meet. Now her daughter was asking him to finish what she had started. He touched the compass in his pocket, feeling its weight alongside Sarah's ring and the broken locket. Some journeys led to places a man never imagined going. Some choices defined everything that came after. Yes, he said quietly. We do. The evidence Grace had died gathering would either save them all or get them killed. But Thomas Granger was finally ready to be the man both Grace and Sarah had believed him to be. The Winchester rifle had hung over Thomas's fireplace for 15 years, a wedding gift from Sarah's father, who believed every ranch needed proper protection. Sarah had always hated the gun, said it made the living room feel hostile when it should feel welcoming. Thomas had kept it loaded anyway, though more from habit than necessity. Now, as he cleaned the barrel and checked the mechanism in the pale light of dawn, he understood that some preparations were born of hope, while others grew from certainty. You really think it'll come to that? Doc Henderson sat at the kitchen table, nursing his third cup of coffee and looking older than his 72 years. Thomas had called him before sunrise, and the old physician had arrived within the hour, bringing with him the kind of steady presence that came from decades of dealing with life's worst moments. I hope not. But Jake Morrison isn't the kind of man who walks away quietly when cornered. Thomas set the rifle against the kitchen counter and joined Doc at the table. And according to Grace's letters, he's got Sheriff Bailey in his pocket. That means we can't count on official help if things go sideways. Doc Henderson had been the closest thing to law enforcement Willowbrook County could trust since Bailey's election 5 years earlier. The old doctor had seen enough suspicious deaths and unexplained injuries to understand that some crimes never made it into official reports. When Thomas had shown him Grace's evidence, Doc's weathered face had gone white with recognition. I should have spoken up years ago, Doc said now, staring into his coffee cup. The signs were all there. Women coming into my office with injuries that didn't match their stories. Others who simply disappeared between appointments. I told myself it wasn't my business to question what adults chose to do with their lives. We all told ourselves convenient stories. Doc, the question now is what we're willing to do about it. The kitchen door opened, and Rosa entered, carrying a plate of fresh tortillas and a pot of beans that would feed them through whatever was coming. She had spent the night at the ranch, refusing to leave Lila alone while Thomas made his preparations. Now she moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that some battles required more than just weapons and good intentions. The little one is still sleeping, Rosa reported, settling into the third chair. But she will not stay that way much longer. That child has her mother's strength, Thomas. She will want to be part of whatever happens next. Thomas had been dreading this conversation. Lila had spent yesterday studying her mother's evidence with the focused intensity of a child who understood that adult secrets often held the keys to everything that mattered. She had asked questions about the photographs, traced the locations on Grace's map with her finger, and quietly absorbed the reality that her mother was never coming home. Through it all, she had maintained a composure that broke Thomas's heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. She can't be involved in the confrontation itself, Thomas said. Whatever else happens, Lila needs to be somewhere safe when I face Morrison. Where will be safe? Rosa's question cut to the heart of the matter. If Morrison realizes what we know, if he understands that Grace left evidence behind, he will not stop with you, Thomas. He will hunt down everyone connected to this matter. Doc Henderson nodded grimly. Rosa's right. Morrison has too much to lose to leave loose ends. And that includes an 8-year-old girl who could testify about her mother's discoveries. The weight of this responsibility settled over Thomas like a lead blanket. In agreeing to help Lila find her mother, he had thought he was taking on a simple missing person case. Now he understood that Grace Washington's courage had drawn them all into a war against forces that would kill anyone who threatened their power. Then we don't give him the chance to hunt us down, Thomas said. We move first, and we make sure we have enough evidence to bury him so deep he never sees daylight again. The plan they developed over the next hour was born of desperation and tempered by experience. Doc Henderson would take copies of Grace's evidence to a federal judge he knew in Austin, someone beyond Morrison's influence who could issue warrants and demand federal investigation. Rosa would drive Lila to her sister's house in San Antonio, where the girl would be safe until the situation resolved itself. Thomas would confront Morrison directly, using the original evidence as leverage to force a confession. It was a plan with more holes than a screen door, but it was the best they could manage with the resources and time available. "You understand that Morrison might just shoot you on sight?" Doc said as they reviewed the details one final time. "A man with his reputation doesn't got where he is by negotiating with threats to his empire." Thomas touched the rifle leaning against the counter. "And I guess I better make sure I see him first." The sound of small feet on the stairs interrupted their planning. Lila appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing one of Thomas's old shirts as a nightgown and clutching Martha against her chest. Her dark eyes moved from one adult face to another, reading the tension and determination with the peculiar insight children possessed for adult emotions. "You're going to fight the bad man today," she said. It was not a question. Thomas knelt down to her level, meeting those serious eyes with as much honesty as he dared. "I'm going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt your mother. But you're going to be somewhere safe while that happens. I want to come with you." "I know you do, honey. But this is grown-up business, and grown-up business can be dangerous. Your mother died protecting you, Lila. I'm not going to let that sacrifice be wasted by putting you in harm's way." Lila studied his face for a long moment, and Thomas could see Grace's intelligence looking back at him through her daughter's eyes. Finally she nodded. "Okay, but you have to promise me something, Mr. Thomas." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll come back. Promise me I won't lose you too." The request hit him like a physical blow, carrying with it all the fear and love of a child who had already lost more than anyone should have to lose. Thomas reached out and pulled Lila into a fierce embrace, breathing in the scent of soap and childhood that reminded him of everything worth protecting in the world. "I promise," he whispered into her hair. "I promise I'll come back to you." It was a promise he had no right to make, given what they were facing. But some commitments transcended probability and entered the realm of sacred vows. Thomas Granger would come back to this child, or he would die trying. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Doc Henderson loaded copies of Grace's evidence into his medical bag and prepared for the drive to Austin. Rosa packed a small suitcase for Lila and made arrangements with her sister. Thomas cleaned the rifle one final time, checked his ammunition, and tried not to think about the fact that he had never shot at another human being in his life. As Rosa and Lila prepared to leave, the little girl approached Thomas one last time. In her hands she held Martha, the worn doll that had been her constant companion through everything. "I want you to take her," Lila said, holding the doll out to him. "Honey, Martha's yours. She belongs with you. My mama made Martha to protect me when I was scared. Now I want her to protect you." Lila pressed the doll into his hands with solemn ceremony. "Martha's real good at keeping people safe. She kept me safe all the way to your house in that storm." Thomas accepted the doll with the reverence appropriate to receiving a sacred trust. Martha's button eyes seemed to regard him with ancient wisdom, and her yarn hair was soft from years of being loved by small hands. "I'll take good care of her," he promised. "I know you will. And she'll take good care of you." After Rosa and Lila disappeared down the ranch road in Rosa's old Buick, Thomas stood in his empty house and tried to prepare himself for what was coming. The rifle lay across his kitchen table alongside Grace's map and photographs. Martha sat in the chair Lila had occupied, her cloth face somehow managing to convey both comfort and determination. Outside, the Texas sun climbed toward its zenith, burning off the morning coolness and promising another scorching day. In a few hours, Thomas would drive to the Morrison Ranch and confront a man who had built an empire on violence and silence. He might return home victorious, bearing justice for Grace Washington and safety for her daughter. Or he might not return at all, but for the first time in 2 years, Thomas Granger felt truly alive. The grief that had consumed him since Sarah's death had not disappeared. It never would, but it had transformed into something useful, a driving force that demanded action rather than paralysis. He picked up Martha and settled her carefully in his shirt pocket. right next to the compass and Sarah's ring. Some talismans were for remembering the past, others for navigating toward an uncertain future, and still others for carrying the love of brave souls into battle. Thomas was ready to honor them all. The Morrison Ranch house rose from the Texas landscape like a monument to ill-gotten gains, all white columns and sprawling porches that spoke of wealth built on other people's suffering. Thomas parked his truck in the circular drive, noting the expensive cars scattered around the property and the armed men who watched his arrival from the shadows of the barn and bunkhouse. Jake Morrison emerged onto the front porch as Thomas climbed out of his truck, the rifle held loosely in one hand and Grace's evidence folder tucked under his other arm. Morrison's smile was the same predatory expression Thomas remembered from their encounter at the abandoned cabin. But now it carried an edge of anticipation that made his skin crawl. "Thomas Granger," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the yard with theatrical warmth. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Though I have to say, the rifle seems a bit excessive for a social call." "This isn't a social call, Jake. We need to talk." Morrison gestured toward the porch chairs with exaggerated courtesy. "By all means. Can I offer you something to drink?" "It's a hot day for dramatic confrontations." Thomas kept his distance, staying in the yard where he could see Morrison's men and they could see him. "I know what you did to Grace Washington, and I have proof." The smile never wavered, but something shifted behind Morrison's eyes. "Grace Washington? The colored woman who came looking for work a few weeks back? I told her I had nothing available. Haven't seen her since." "That's a lie." Thomas opened the folder and pulled out one of Grace's photographs, holding it up so Morrison could see the damning documents it contained. "She worked for you just long enough to discover what you're really running here. And she was smart enough to gather evidence before you killed her." Morrison's composure slipped for just a moment, long enough for Thomas to see the calculation behind his facade. Then the smile returned, wider and more dangerous than before. "Those are some serious accusations, Thomas. I hope you have more than grainy photographs to support them." Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded document that had been wrapped separately from the others. It was Grace's final letter, but this one had been addressed not to Lila, but to anyone who finds this evidence. "Grace Washington wrote a full confession before you killed her," Thomas said, beginning to read from the letter. "She documented your smuggling operation, your connection to Sheriff Bailey, and the locations where you buried the other women who learned too much." As Thomas read, Morrison's expression gradually darkened. The letter contained details no outside observer could have known. The names of Morrison's contacts in Mexico, the schedule of illegal border crossings, the amounts of money changing hands. Grace had risked everything to gather this information, knowing it would likely cost her life. "She also left a map," Thomas continued, "showing exactly where you buried Betsy Harper, Maria Santos, and the others. 5 women in 3 years, Jake. 5 mothers and daughters who trusted you for work and ended up in unmarked graves." Morrison stepped down from the porch, his movement fluid and threatening. "You know what I think, Thomas? I think you're a lonely old man who's let his imagination run wild. A man who's been talking to the wrong people and believing stories that don't make sense. The federal judge in Austin, who's reviewing this evidence right now, would disagree with you." For the first time, Morrison's mask slipped completely. "You didn't. Doc Henderson is halfway to Austin by now, with copies of everything Grace left behind. By tomorrow morning, you'll have federal marshals crawling all over this property with search warrants and excavation equipment." Morrison's hand moved toward the gun holstered at his hip, but Thomas was ready for him. The Winchester came up smoothly, its barrel finding Morrison's chest with practiced ease. "I wouldn't. Jake, too many witnesses for you to clean up this time." As if summoned by his words, the sound of car engines filled the air. But instead of Morrison's reinforcements, the vehicles that pulled into the yard carried unexpected passengers. Rosa's Buick led the convoy, followed by Doc Henderson's sedan and 2 cars Thomas didn't recognize. Rosa climbed out first, her face grim with determination. But it was the small figure who emerged from the passenger seat that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. "Lila," he whispered. "I told you to stay safe." The 8-year-old girl walked across the yard with her mother's dignity, clutching something in her small hands. Behind her, Doc Henderson approached with several men in suits, federal agents. Thomas realized, drawn by evidence too compelling to ignore, "I couldn't stay away." "Mr. Thomas," Lila said, her voice carrying clearly in the tension-filled air. "My mama died for this. I had to be here to see it finished." In her hands, she held the final piece of Grace's evidence, a detailed written testimony that named names, provided dates, and offered a first-hand account of Morrison's crimes that would hold up in any court. Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, understanding finally that his empire was crumbling. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice filled with venom. "The people I work for don't forget. They don't forgive. Then you'd better hope federal prison is safer than Texas," Thomas replied. The moment of reckoning Grace Washington had died to bring about was finally at hand. The federal agents moved with the kind of professional efficiency that came from years of dismantling criminal enterprises. Special Agent Patricia Coleman, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, took charge of the scene with quiet authority while her partners secured Morrison and began reading him his rights. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, smuggling, and violation of federal interstate commerce laws." Agent Coleman's voice carried across the ranch yard like a judgment that had been too long delayed. "You have the right to remain silent." "This is harassment," Morrison snarled, even as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. "I know people in Washington. I have connections. Your connections can't help you now," Agent Coleman replied. "We've been building a case against your operation for 2 years. The evidence Mrs. Washington gathered just gave us everything we needed to make it stick." Thomas watched as Morrison was loaded into the back of a federal vehicle, the man's composure finally cracking as the reality of his situation settled in. The ranch that had served as his criminal headquarters was already being cordoned off with federal crime scene tape, and additional agents were arriving to begin the grim work of excavating the graves Grace's map had revealed. "Mr. Thomas," Lila approached him as the last of the official vehicles disappeared down the ranch road. "Is it really over?" Thomas knelt down to her level, looking into those serious dark eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. "The legal part is just beginning, honey. But the dangerous part, the part where bad men could hurt you or anyone else, that's over." Doc Henderson joined them, looking exhausted but satisfied. "I've never seen federal agents move that fast on anything." Grace's evidence was so thorough, so detailed, they couldn't ignore it even if they wanted to. "What happens now?" Rosa asked, settling a protective hand on Lila's shoulder. Agent Coleman approached before Thomas could answer, her expression gentler than it had been during the arrest. "Now we prosecute a case that should send Morrison away for the rest of his life. But more importantly, we use his information to roll up the entire smuggling network he was part of." She turned to Thomas with something approaching respect in her eyes. "What you did here took considerable courage. Mr. Granger, most people would have walked away rather than risk confronting someone with Morrison's resources and connections." "I had help," Thomas said, glancing at Lila. "More help than I deserved." The weeks that followed blurred together in a mixture of legal proceedings, media attention, and gradual healing. Morrison's arrest had exposed a network of corruption that reached into multiple counties and state agencies. Sheriff Bailey resigned in disgrace after his own connections to the operation came to light, replaced by a federal appointee who promised to clean up the department's practices. The excavations at Morrison's ranch confirmed the worst fears: 5 unmarked graves containing the remains of women who had disappeared. Over the past 3 years, Grace Washington's body was found in the location she had marked on her map, allowing her daughter to finally have a proper funeral and burial. Thomas had expected the service to be a small, quiet affair, but Grace's courage had touched people throughout the county. The church was packed with mourners, Some who had known her personally, others who had simply been moved by her story. Rosa had organized everything, understanding that Grace deserved to be honored, not just as a victim, but as a hero who had saved lives with her bravery. Standing beside the grave as the preacher spoke about grace and redemption, Thomas felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. His wife would have been proud of what he had done, proud that he had found his way back to being the man she had always believed him to be. "Mama would have liked that service," Lila said afterward as they walked back toward Thomas's truck. "She always said people should be remembered for the good they did, not just the bad things that happened to them. Your mother was a remarkable woman, Lila, and she raised a remarkable daughter." The legal adoption proceedings had begun the week after Morrison's arrest. Thomas had never imagined himself as a father, but grief had taught him that families could be formed in unexpected ways. When the family court judge asked Lila if she wanted Thomas Granger to become her legal guardian, her answer had been immediate and certain. "He already is," she had said simply. "He just needs the papers to make it official." Now, 6 weeks later, Thomas held those papers in his hands, official documents that declared Lila Washington Granger to be his daughter in the eyes of the law. The birth certificate bore her new name with all the authority of the state of Texas, but more importantly, it represented something both of them had found when they needed it most: a family. "Are you ready to go home?" Thomas asked, opening the truck door for her. Lila climbed into the passenger seat. Martha held securely in her lap and smiled up at him with an expression that reminded him of all the reasons life was worth living. "Yes, Daddy, I'm ready to go home." The word hit him like a blessing he had never expected to receive. Daddy, after 2 years of believing he would never matter to another soul, this brave little girl had given him back his purpose and his future. As they drove toward the ranch, Thomas touched the compass in his pocket one final time. Its needle pointed steady and true, guiding them toward whatever came next in their life together. 1 year after the storm that changed everything, Thomas Granger stood in his garden, watching his daughter chase fireflies through the gathering dusk. Lila had grown taller in the months since becoming a Granger, her face fuller and more confident, though she still carried Martha everywhere they went. The worn doll had become a symbol of continuity, connecting the brave child who had knocked on his door to the happy girl who now filled his house with laughter and purpose. The garden itself was Sarah's legacy transformed into something new, a place where past and present could coexist in growing harmony. Thomas had maintained his wife's roses and tomatoes, but Lila had added her own touches: a small herb patch where she grew the cooking spices Rosa had taught her to use, and a section of wildflowers that attracted butterflies and reminded them both that beauty could grow from the most unlikely soil. At the garden's center, where Sarah's memorial bench had once stood alone, a new stone monument now rose from carefully tended earth. The memorial stone was simple granite, engraved with words Thomas and Lila had chosen together: Grace Marie Washington, 1924-1952. Beloved mother, brave woman, she died so others might live. Below Grace's inscription, a smaller line read, "All who knew her were made better by her courage." The memorial garden had become a place of pilgrimage for people throughout the county and beyond. Families of the other women Morrison had killed came to pay their respects, finding comfort in knowing their loved ones were finally remembered and honored. Social workers brought groups of young women to hear Lila tell her mother's story, teaching them that even the powerless could fight injustice when they refused to accept silence. Thomas had worried initially about the attention, concerned that constant visitors would prevent Lila from healing properly. But he had come to understand that his daughter possessed her mother's gift for turning personal pain into collective strength. Speaking about Grace's courage seemed to help Lila process her grief while inspiring others to find their own bravery. "Daddy, look," Lila called out, cupping her hands around a particularly large firefly.
"I caught one,"
Thomas walked over to examine her prize, marveling as he did every day at the simple miracle of being called by that name. Fatherhood had come to him late and unexpectedly, but it fit him like clothing he had been meant to wear all his life. "That's a good one," he agreed, watching the insect's light pulse between Lila's fingers. "But maybe we should let him go rejoin his family." Lila opened her hands and watched the firefly spiral upward toward the darkening sky. "Do you think Mama can see him from heaven?" It was the kind of question children asked when they were testing the boundaries between hope and reality, needing adult reassurance that love could transcend death. Thomas had learned to answer such questions with the honesty they deserved. "I think your mama can see everything that matters, sweetheart. And I think she's proud of how brave and kind you've become." They settled on the bench beside Grace's stone, a nightly ritual that had developed naturally over the months. Sometimes they talked about the day's events, Lila's progress in the new integrated school that had opened in Willowbrook, Thomas's work with the county commission on improving conditions for seasonal workers, the letters they received from people whose lives had been touched by Grace's story. Other evenings, like this one, they simply sat in comfortable silence and watched the night settle over their land. Rosa emerged from the house carrying a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade and a plate of the sugar cookies Lila loved. At 71, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her presence remained a source of stability and wisdom that held their unusual family together. She had officially moved into the guest bedroom 6 months earlier, claiming she was too old to maintain her own place. Everyone knew the real reason was that she could not bear to be separated from the child she had helped save. "The courthouse called while you two were out here communing with the mosquitoes," Rosa announced, settling onto the bench beside them. "Judge Morrison's sentencing is scheduled for next month. No relation to Jake Morrison, Judge Helena Morrison was the federal judge who would determine how the rest of Jake's life would be spent. The man who had built an empire on violence and silence was facing multiple life sentences, his criminal network dismantled and his assets seized to compensate his victims' families. Will I have to testify again?" Lila asked, though her voice carried more curiosity than fear. "Only if you want to," Thomas assured her. "The prosecutors have enough evidence to convict him 10 times over. But if you want to speak at his sentencing, to tell the judge about your mother and what he took from you, they'll make sure you have that chance." Lila considered this possibility while sipping her lemonade. At 9 years old, she had already shown more courage than most adults would display in a lifetime. But Thomas was determined that she would never feel pressured to carry burdens beyond what a child should bear. "I think Mama would want me to speak for her," Lila said eventually. "Not because I hate him, but because someone should say her name in that courtroom and make sure everyone remembers she was a real person who mattered." Thomas felt his chest tighten with pride and sorrow in equal measure. This child had inherited her mother's gift for transforming suffering into purpose, for finding light in the darkest circumstances. As the first stars appeared overhead, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a man consumed by grief, going through the motions of living without really being alive. Now he was part of a family again, connected to the world by bonds of love and responsibility that made every day meaningful. The storm that had brought Lila to his door had seemed like tragedy at first, another loss to add to a life already too familiar with losing. Instead, it had been the beginning of salvation for both of them. Grace Washington's courage had saved more than just the women who might have died if Morrison's crimes had continued. It had saved a lonely man from drowning in his own sorrow and given him the chance to honor her memory by loving her daughter as fiercely as she deserved. "Time to go inside," Rosa announced, gathering the empty glasses. "School morning comes early." As they walked toward the house, Lila slipped her small hand into Thomas's, a gesture so natural and trusting it still took his breath away. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, the ongoing legal proceedings, the letters from people seeking help with their own missing family members, the daily work of building a life worthy of Grace's sacrifice. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply a family walking home together under the Texas stars, carrying love forward into whatever the future might hold.